Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is Wednesday, and of course, last night was the State of the Union address, and we're going to probably save most of the comments for the next hour. Penna Dexter will be joining me at 1 o'clock Central Time, and we'll go through some of the clips that actually, I think, illustrate some of the things that the president said, and then also go into your comments as well. But I, as many times, try to communicate, in addition to everyone talking about the State of the Union address, and we will certainly give it probably 2 hours in the next hour, there are some other things to cover, not the least of which is the winding down of this issue of impeachment. So I want to get to that in just a minute, because that is an important issue as well. But let me just say that if you go into kind of a preview for what we'll be talking about, many people say that this was an example of what Ronald Reagan called for back in 1975. When he was speaking at CPAC, he actually said that we need a country, but in particular a political party, that is really flying a banner of no pale pastels but bold colors. And there were some pretty striking things made and said by the president. And so we'll certainly get into some of that. But if you find yourself want to kind of look ahead, we have the transcript of the State of the Union address on the website. We have a couple of issues in regards to that as well, one of which about the child that is born after 21 weeks and calling for using that as an illustration for ending late-term abortion. And we even have a fact check there that you can look at that Penna and I will be depending on a little bit later. But even as he was last night giving his third State of the Union address, in probably one of the more difficult sets of circumstances, the only other president to have had a situation in which he was presenting the State of the Union address while still under the cloud of impeachment, of course, as we've been talking about the last couple of days, has been Bill Clinton. And so the idea is that there will probably be a vote to acquit the president in a few hours here. And I'll give you all the background on this as well. But he spent some time actually not talking about the impeachment, but talked about judicial nominees. He talked about health care. He talked about the military. He talked about, of course, as I mentioned, abortion and all the rest, and delivered the speech when now we have a Gallup poll that says his approval rating is at 49%, the highest it's ever been for his presidency. And as I have said many times before, there is usually a little bit of a bounce after a State of the Union address. Not always. There have been a few exceptions to that, so I don't want to always say that it's predictable, but it's possible. And if that's the case, the only way you can go from 49 is 50 or 51, and that becomes a majority. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays itself out. But I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the winding down of this issue of impeachment. And what we have right now is a series of messages that various senators were able to give. The decision that was made on the weekend is that we will allow for closing arguments on Monday. And I want to go back and spend some time really citing in some detail these closing arguments by Jay Sekulow. One, because I thought they were very good. Two, because Jay Sekulow has been on this program with us before. So I thought you might want to hear that, since it probably was completely drowned out by, of course, the focus on the Iowa caucus, which turned out to be another debacle. We'll talk about that a little bit later this hour as well. But nevertheless, the decision was then they would allow for speeches to be given in the well of the Senate, But because of the way that is structured, that provided a little bit of freedom for two very important groups of individual. One individual in particular was the Chief Justice of the United States, because since it was not part of the trial, that allowed Chief Justice John Roberts to take a break from presiding over the Senate to be engaged in any kind of judicial activities. And, of course, he was present last night at the State of the Union address. Number two, of course, it gave freedom for some of these candidates. Recognize you have a couple of senators there, including Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, who are involved in a campaign and wanted to make their way back to Iowa and those kinds of things. So that continues on till 4 p.m. today, unless they've changed the time and the date, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. And then there will be the final vote, and the vote can be postpone again, because it's quite possible that there would be attempts to add additional resolutions, maybe even try to revisit whether or not to call various witnesses and whatever. And so whether there'll be a stalling tactic or an 11th hour revelation or something like that, we will find out really after this program ends. But we'll see what happens. And if not, then sooner or later there will be a vote to acquit. And, of course, that's a big issue as well, because who will be the people that may or may not vote to acquit? And that brings me to some of the guesses that people are actually trying to have right now, because if you think about that, there are some that may actually say they would want to vote to acquit, but they recognize there's a tremendous amount of pressure on them, and those would be the Democrats, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Doug Jones from Alabama, and Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, who, by the way, a couple of times was standing up and applauding when she was the only Democrat to do so. She's a Democrat who, at least on some issues, at least somewhat agrees with the Republicans or with some of the other Republican senators from which she's worked across the aisle. I know that's kind of rare these days, but she's done that. I've got a piece here by Jim Garrity who's suggesting that it's possible that the vote for removal could be 44 votes, but he's pretty much thinking it probably would end up being 46, with only maybe Joe Manchin actually switching sides. We'll see. This is something, as I go through this in just a minute, to remember, because as I go through the closing arguments by Jay Sekulow, and I'll do this after the break, you have to recognize that this has consequences, especially for somebody like Doug Jones in Alabama, if for no other reason than he was sort of elected by the slimmest of all margins, and he is going to be facing a very significant re-election challenge. Kyrsten Sinema can say, well, okay, I'm not going to be up for re-election for a while, so maybe I could get away with that vote either way and not risk too much, but we'll see where that takes us. But what I want to do is really kind of after the break spend just a little bit of time talking about this whole kind of end discussion. And it went in two different ways. Before we take a break, let's just talk about the kind of comments that were being made by the House Democrats. And, of course, the one that is the biggest eye roller or head scratcher that you could possibly have imagined. Because when I first heard it, I'm thinking, there is just no way they said that. Oh, yeah, I guess it was. Adam Schiff, if Trump isn't removed, he could offer Alaska to the Russians in exchange for support in the next election, or decide to move to Mar-a-Lago permanently and leave Jared Kushner to run the country, delegating him the decision whether they go to war. What? I mean, you can't even make this stuff up. Of course, there was a sighting of Harry Potter and a few other things as well, but just amazing, all the things that get said, and hard to even make some of that up. But nevertheless, that was said. So let's come back to some seriousness. That is some of the closing arguments by Jay Sekulow, because I think what it did was really kind of summarize the arguments in a very effective way. And then at the end, let me summarize his 11 points in case some of those came fast and furious. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Members of the very popular South Korean boy band were denied draft exemptions even though it would reduce revenue to the country. Why? Because there aren't enough boys available to serve in the military. Lyman Stone uses this illustration to highlight the extremely low birth rate in South Korea. But that country is just one of many examples of what has become a global birth dearth. Fertility rates have been declining in all the developed countries of the world. The U.S. figures are better than in many countries in Europe and Asia, but still illustrate the decline. Fertility rates in this country declined from 2.1 children per woman in 2006 to 1.7 today. The figure might even drop lower if we hit another recession. Although legalized abortion, contraception, and down economy are often cited for the reasons for lower fertility, those factors only explain part of the decline. The U.S. first reached birth rates around 2 children per woman during the Roaring '20s, not during the Great Depression and long before contraceptive access was readily available. Modern economies depend on various transfers of wealth across generations. The obvious examples are Social Security and other so-called entitlement programs. An older generation also expects the younger generation to buy their houses and other assets, but that's not happening. Even the trade deficit is due in part to the fact that there are more assets than there are buyers to purchase them. The solution, it seems, is not to pass government policies that try to make people want to have children. The best that can be done would be to eliminate government policies that currently penalize couples with children. At the least, government should reduce the financial barriers for parents who want to bring kids into the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a little bit more time talking about this idea of the impeachment vote taking place perhaps today. Certainly a couple of votes. Whether the final vote will be taking place today, I don't know. I suspect it will be, but you just never can predict anything, especially in the United States Senate. Then after this, I want to, of course, spend a little bit of time talking about, just briefly, what's been happening up there in Iowa. It's just kind of crazy, and there were some funny things that happened, including Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who was actually claiming victory when we had no numbers, and that one caused even some of the Democrats to say, what? And, of course, the Sanders campaign said, you're not that far ahead, and matter of fact, we are doing quite well as well. Since we're talking about elections, and many of you are in the state of Texas, I'll use the Texas example, but it's the only one of many, and that is, as we mentioned yesterday in my Viewpoints commentary, we are in a time in which census is going to be taking place this month and especially next month. And then eventually the legislature is going to have to redraw these congressional lines, these legislative lines. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how that takes place. Then Ken Blackwell's written a very good piece about religious liberty, which was one of the themes last night that was mentioned by President Donald Trump. And I even saw a note from Kelly Shackelford saying, hey, they mentioned our case about the cross. We'll get into that. And before we're done, just thought I'd have a little bit of fun at the expense of Elizabeth Warren, but not the only one. You may have seen the video, because a lot of people are showing it now, where she gets off of a private jet looks over and sees there's a camera, so then essentially tries to hide behind one of the staffers as she's getting off the private jet. Well, our good friend Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us a week from this Friday, has actually taken the time through some other research to find out how much these various presidential candidates who lecture us about having a small carbon footprint, how many of them actually have a very large carbon footprint by using these private jets. So it came out perfectly. He had this column, I'm sure, written a few days ago, and then the Elizabeth Warren one just fits perfectly hand in glove. So those are just a few things we'll talk about before we then, in the 1 o'clock hour, spend some time talking about, of course, the State of the Union address. Well, let's go to Jay Sekulow. Jay Sekulow has been on the program. He was the founder of the American Center for Law and Justice. He's been a good friend of ours, a very close friend of Kelly Shackelford. Both of them actually sit on a board of the Supreme Court, and that's kind of interesting, which we have talked about before with Kelly. And he was given part of the responsibility for making the closing arguments, since I think some really good arguments were made, and it was completely obliterated by all the coverage of the Iowa caucus. I thought I would just take a few minutes to summarize some of this. And the first thing he said is that we believe that we have established overwhelmingly that both articles of impeachment failed to allege impeachable offenses, and therefore both Articles 1 and 2 must fail. Then he spent some time saying, let's look back for just a minute. He said, on the screen right now, I have a Washington Post headline, January 20th, 2017. And it has the headline, The Campaign to Impeach President Trump Has Begun. He said this was posted 19 minutes after he was sworn in. Also want to play a video where members as early as January 15th, before the president was sworn into office, were calling for his impeachment. The video has Jamie Raskin, Maxine Waters, of course, Al Green, Steve Cohen, Joaquin Castro, as well as Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Elizabeth Warren, Jerry Nadler, and others. They're all calling for impeachment. And that actually, in many cases, were people making the statement before the man even had taken the oath of office. Then he reminds them as he's going back, and I won't go through all the rest because he's got quite a bit there, the fact that the lawyer for the whistleblower actually sent out a tweet, and that was on January 30th, and it had hashtag the coup has started. So the point he's making is this has been something that's been in the works for a long, long time and has really nothing to do necessarily with the Ukraine phone call. And so what he says is what the House Democrats have done to this nation, to the Constitution, to the office of the president, and to the president himself and to the body is outrageous. And I think you could make that case very clearly, as we have, because now we've lowered the threshold for impeachment, and we've also allowed individuals to make anonymous claims and all sorts of other things. As he goes on a little bit later, he says, we've already said many times the charges themselves do not allege a crime or a misdemeanor, let alone a high crime or misdemeanor. There's nothing in the charges that would permit the removal of a duly elected president or warrant the negation of an election and the subversion of the American people's will. He goes on for a little bit longer on those things as well. And then he finally says the bottom line is the president's opponents don't like the president. They really don't like his policies. And he then begins to cite various individuals who were called in the House impeachment hearings who basically made the statement that we just don't like what the president is doing. The House managers brought up the idea that this is the fact that we don't like his policies, and then points to page 155 of the transcript of the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who said that he didn't know if there was a crime or anything of that nature, but he did have deep policy concerns. So he's making the case that a lot of this has to do with policy or just an animus towards the president and nothing else. So all of that is the argument he made towards the first article of impeachment. Then he takes on the second article of impeachment, saying that President Trump in no way obstructed Congress. The president acted, he said, with extraordinary transparency by declassifying and releasing the transcript of the July 25th call. And then he takes on the issue of what's called executive privilege. He said, I've heard over and over again phrases like cover-up, and that is the assertion that a privilege, exercising executive privilege, is a cover-up. But, of course, it's not. It's something that every president Bill Clinton is a Democrat. He did it many times. Barack Obama is a Democrat. He did it many times. Certainly President George W. Bush did it a number of times for no other reason than, of course, we were in the midst of a war on terrorism. And so to then say that now when President Donald Trump asserts executive privilege, somehow that's unconstitutional, that's a justification for impeachment. And to make his case, Jay Sekulow actually quotes the Supreme Court, which basically says to punish a person because he has done what the law allows him to do is a due process violation of the basic order, and for an agent of the state to pursue a course of action whose objective is to penalize a person's reliance on his constitutional rights is patently unconstitutional. Then he quotes from another Supreme Court document, which also says that privileges serve to protect the innocent who otherwise might be ensnared by ambiguous circumstances, and then quotes in even a third Supreme Court case in which it was generally regarded that as of now, as a privilege, the great value, the protection of the innocent. And so the bottom line is he says, look, we've used executive privilege, every president has, and it's done for very good reasons, not the least of which he doesn't mention here, but I'll mention, and that is individuals, when they speak to the president in confidence about a national security issue, cannot then wonder if that statement that they made shows up in the public when you're sometimes evaluating organizations, countries, dictators, all sorts of things. And then he also says, let's not forget that the House barred the attendance of the executive branch counsel at witness proceedings when executive branch members were being examined. And then he went on to say that whenever you have a dispute about this issue of executive privilege, then you let a judge make that decision. But he says the House withdrew, even as the judge was going to make that decision, the subpoena, and removed the recipient's case from the court to rule. Now, was it because they didn't like the judge that was selected? Was it because they didn't like the way the ruling was going to go? Was it because they didn't have means to have that witness in the first place? He says, we don't know, but the reality is they withdrew that subpoena. And so the assertion of a valid constitutional privilege cannot be, by definition, an impeachable offense, he says. So he says, in passing the first article of impeachment, the House attempted to usurp the president's constitutional power to determine policy, especially foreign policy. And in passing the second article of impeachment, the House attempted to control the constitutional privileges and immunities of the executive branch. That's kind of his closing statements, but then he also very quickly quoted from Alexander Hamilton, who he mentioned all sorts of people have been quoting. And if you go to Federalist Paper number 65, you can see that Alexander Hamilton also was fearful of the fact that impeachment might be used to connect with pre-existing factions and enlist all their animosities, their penalties and influences and interests on one side or the other. In other words, they're afraid that it might be used in a political way. So that's kind of his summary. But when we come back from the break, just real quickly, there's another way to summarize this, and this very good article looks at each one of those points, and there's 11 different points that were made by Jay Sekulow, so I'm going to read through them pretty quickly, but it's just an illustration, again, that we probably missed a very good and I think cogent summary of why impeachment needs to be turned down today. We'll be back right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies. distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention as a program note, about a half an hour from now, Penna Dexter will be joining me, and for the 2 hours, we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about the State of the Union address. But I did want to spend just a little bit of time here talking about this issue of the impeachment trial. And Jim Garrity points out the fact that really Nancy Pelosi was kind of drug into this whole issue of impeachment as Speaker of the House. She really tried as best she could for, as they say, about 3/4 of the year 2019 to try to avoid this if possible, because she had seen, if nothing else from history, what had happened with Bill Clinton. And the concern is that, well, maybe this would be helpful for the Democrats, but she didn't really share that. And now, if anything, we can see, as Jim Garrity says, if it had any effect on the approval rating of Donald Trump, it actually probably increased it a little bit. And so you have, even in the late hours, just finally the idea that, okay, I guess we really have to get behind this. And on December 5th, you have Nancy Pelosi saying, if we do not act now, we would be derelict in our duty. And then talked about 2 weeks later that it's a matter of fact that the president is an ongoing threat to our national security. So they voted to impeach the president, and then they adjourned for quite a number of weeks in the summer for that issue, of course. And then, of course, they also then she simply held on to those articles of impeachment for the longest period of time that has ever happened in the history of the Republic. So then you fast forward to the fact that eventually then it rolls into the State of the Union address. And I still wonder if there weren't some Democrats saying, let's just get this impeachment vote over last Saturday so that it isn't over the head of the president with the State of the Union address. I even wondered when it got postponed, even pushed forward, whether the president would go and speak, because, of course, that's the big issue. And interestingly enough, there are some individuals that have actually looked at this and said, this makes no sense. As one commentator put it, Democrats invited Trump to take advantage of this majestic setting, that is Congress, for what's basically a campaign speech. At the same time, they were saying he had to be removed from office or the Republic and the Constitution would fall. That makes no sense. So whether you're on one side of the aisle or the other, whether you believe that the president should have been removed or not, you have to say it ended up in such a situation where last night the president was able to give a State of the Union address with that hanging over his head and with his approval rating the highest it ever was, and for the American people probably more interested than normal because they wondered what in the world he was going to say. And so that's what you ended up with. Just before we move on, though, let me just mention that just a few minutes ago I mentioned the very good material put together by Jay Sekulow. He's been on the program with us before. We're hoping to get him on in the future. He has been kind of busy, so it's kind of hard to think about getting him on the program. But he really had a number of points, and this very good piece that came out recently kind of summarized the 11 points. And I'll just go through them very quickly, but it illustrates the point. Point number one, the House ran an impeachment campaign for the last 3 years. We just talked about that a minute ago, starting even before the president actually was sworn into office. Number two, the House ran a partisan presidential impeachment hearings because, as I think illustrated, you had no Republicans vote for it, and their partisan nature, I think, was pointed out very well by Jay Sekulow. Number three, the articles of impeachment are the product of a impeachment inquiry that seemed to violate all the notions of due process and fundamental fairness. And I mentioned just one of many things that Jay Sekulow had in his closing arguments. Number four, the articles of impeachment do not allege a crime or a misdemeanor, let alone a high crime or misdemeanor. That's, of course, one of the things that Jay Sekulow said, and I mentioned just a minute ago. Number five, the president, under any constitutional structure, is the one who designs and decides nation's foreign policy. And I mentioned just a minute ago the example that Jay Sekulow used of saying, well, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was saying, well, I don't think he committed a crime, but I just don't like his policy. Well, sorry, you're not allowed to make that decision, even though you have great military expertise. That is the responsibility of the man that runs the presidency and is also involved in all sorts of military matters as well. The commander-in-chief. So anyway, let's go on to the next one. 6, there's no definition of high crimes and misdemeanors that includes disagreeing with policy, which we just talked about. Number 7, the assertion of a valid constitutional privilege, which is, again, the idea of executive privilege, is not an impeachable offense. If it was, every president would be guilty of that, and obviously that's not the case. Number 8, the first article of impeachment usurps the president's constitutional role to determine policy. Number 9, the second article of impeachment attempts to control the constitutional privileges and immunities of the executive branch. Number 10, by approving both articles, the House of Representatives violated our constitutional order and abused their power of impeachment. And number 11, the articles of impeachment do not meet the constitutional standards for impeachable offenses. That's an attempt under 11 bullet points to summarize some of the things that were said by Jay Sekulow. So I just thought I'd bring that up. It has been completely obscured with the coverage of first, the Iowa caucuses, and second of all, the State of the Union address. But at least you had a chance to hear it here on Point of View, and we'll get into the State of the Union address in just a minute. Before it fades into obscurity, let's come back to the Iowa caucuses. What a disaster. Okay, and Gary Bauer, good friend here, talked about the fact that we're hoping to have the final sometime in the future of what happened in the Iowa caucus. Recognize this is now Wednesday, still waiting to get anything close to final numbers from Monday night. And, of course, he points out they didn't stop Mayor Pete from declaring victory. And, of course, that caused the Sanders campaign to say, wait a minute, we have internal numbers suggesting we had a good night. Elizabeth Warren's campaign refuted that as well, saying it was too close to call between the three of them. That didn't turn out so well for her. And nothing else. I thought it was kind of interesting. Gary Bauer said after months of campaigning and millions of dollars spent in the state, the Iowa Democrat Party proved itself to be incompetent. They provided pundits and comedians with enough material to last for weeks, you think? And a lot of money and candidate time may have been done for naught. And he then goes on to say something we've talked about before. He says, here's something to think about. The party that fashions itself the party of science thinks that more government is the solution, that believes it can tell the temperature of the entire planet 100 years from now, that thinks it can make better health care decisions for you, nevertheless could not even use a phone app to count votes. And Gary, by the way, points out another one. I'd forgotten about this. There was an app that was used by the Romney-Ryan campaign that had a problem. Of course, I mentioned some of the other apps that have fallen apart, not to mention healthcare.gov. But anyway, he says there's a strong argument, this is his concluding remark, that the ultimate winners of the Iowa caucus were Michael Bloomberg, who skipped the Iowa caucus, and Donald Trump, who crushed his two opponents by winning 97% of the vote, and, of course, by simply showing that those people running against him having a little trouble shooting straight. Let's, before we take a break, do at least something to help you understand what's going to happen in terms of the Texas legislature, because they will be involved in redistricting. And if you remember my Viewpoints commentary from yesterday, I talked about the fact that in addition to who is going to be on the Supreme Court, while policies are going to be implemented and all sorts of other things, the other reason this is perhaps the most important election in your lifetime is we are going to, at the state level, redraw legislative rules and regulations and various lines and those kinds of things, but also redraw some of the congressional districts. And so the Texas lawmakers right now, according to this article, have been touring the state, already starting to begin to figure out where they might start drawing lines and to listen to some of the concerns from some of the residents. The person that heads up a lot of that, the Texas House Redistricting Committee, is Chairman Phil King. He lives over there in I think he's in actually Parker County, but over there in the Fort Worth, Weatherford area. And as a result, has really been involved in this process. And maybe once we get a little further along on the census, maybe we'll bring him in, because both the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution requires redrawing these various voting district boundaries. And as a result, they have to do that in a way that does not violate the Voting Rights Act. Texas is still under it. It shouldn't be, but it is. And then at the same time, try to draw those in a way that gives maybe some preference, if in this case Republicans. And so this will all be, interestingly enough, entered into a computer program designed to create the initial kind of district maps that fit to the criteria of the Voting Rights Act, and also, in many cases, to protect incumbents. And then at that point, then there'll be all sorts of debate about how to move some of those lines in very significant ways. And some of the growth regions right now have been in Austin and in Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth. So expect those lines to be redrawn in pretty unexpected ways. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back in a few more minutes, then we'll focus our time and attention on the State of the Union address last night. But I thought, real quickly, since we oftentimes talk about religious liberty, very good piece that came out today by Ken Blackwell. You might say, who is he? Well, first of all, an individual that many of our friends in Ohio would remember because of his service there in the government. He also is a member of the American Civil Rights Union, not to be confused with American Civil Liberties Union, but this one is more of a conservative group. And he's also been the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Campaign, and he spends some time talking about how important religious freedom is. Reminds us that after the Constitution was ratified, there was a real push to add the Bill of Rights. And so the individual who drafted that, James Madison, drafted the Bill of Rights, and it was ratified a little bit later in 1791. Ken Blackwell says it was no accident that religious freedom was in the First Amendment. The founders sought to protect people from government limiting faith. What they never saw coming was religious oppression from one group of we the people to another. There was a concern at the time that you did not want to have an establishment of religion. So that was certainly a concern because you had state religions and, of course, had the religion of the Church of England imposed on others. Given the fact that you actually had a number of the colonies, now states, that in some cases actually housed individuals that had been seen as dissidents when they were in England, they wanted to make sure that there was no imposing of a religious idea. So that was the first issue. But the other was this idea of free exercise, that you should have the freedom to exercise your religious faith. Because after all, there'd been persecution of Quakers, been persecution of Baptists, back in England, even persecution of the Puritans and some of the others. And so they wanted to prevent that. And the reality is that what Ken Blackwell was talking about is that when you look in this country, there is already, if you will, some persecution of various religious groups. And more importantly, when you look overseas, it's gotten even worse. One of the things he talks about is, according to the FBI, the religious hate crimes were up from about 1,200 in 2010 to 1,800 in 2018, especially in three of the most liberal cities in America. That would be New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Now, you have to begin to ferret some of that out because we've talked about this before. Any kind of hate crime against Muslims has decreased. So where is the increase coming from? Anti-Semitic. As a matter of fact, anti-Semitic violence has increased 58% of the reported crimes. And so this has become a bigger issue. And as you've heard me say before, even though we have a booklet out that we have produced on anti-Semitism, almost need to update it because of all of this that is happening. And so attacks against Christians and Muslims usually comprise religious slurs or vandalism, things like that. But according to the Anti-Defamation League, there were 7,000 reported incidents of anti-Semitic violence. Okay, that is different than somebody calling you a name or even engaged in putting some kind of disparaging or vandalous statement on your house or your church or whatever that might be. And so in some respects, we have more and more growing evidence of kind of a growing and vicious anti-Semitism that has happened in some of these more liberal cities, because you can think of the stabbing at the rabbi's home in New York. You can think of the shooting that killed 3 in a New Jersey kosher grocery store, some of which we've talked about. So those are certainly some examples. Not to be done, though, he also says that the American Civil Rights Union partnered with other religious organizations and freedom organizations, that'd be like the Free First Liberty Institute and others, in opposing the atheist demand to tear down a World War I memorial cross in Maryland and all sorts on the Bladensburg Peace Cross. So he does give some examples as well of some victories on the issue of religious liberty, but then moves from the United States to what's happening overseas. And the State Department has more recently issued an International Religious Freedom Report that identifies Burma, or Myanmar, depending on which one you want to say, as a primary country of particular concern, as you have more and more individuals that are being slaughtered there. Then you have Secretary Mike Pompeo, who actually has also talked about there is a very striking link between religious freedom and other rights. If you look at the annual ranking done by the Heritage Foundation of 180 countries on the basis of their economic freedom, what you find very interestingly here is those countries which have less religious freedom also have less economic freedom. As a matter of fact, if you put the State Department's numbers with the Heritage Foundation numbers, you see something very interesting, that the worst religious freedom oppressors are also the least economically free. That would be Nigeria, Burma, or sometimes called Myanmar, Iran, and, of course, at the very bottom of the list, North Korea. So I oftentimes use this example, and Kelly Shackelford has as well, that even if you're an atheist and say, I really don't care about your religious freedom, you better, because if you lose your freedom, sometimes everybody loses their freedom as well. Well, just before we end, I thought just for a minute, since our good friend Dr. Merrill Matthews has done the work for us. We'd mentioned that, indeed, he says there's a striking example of the Democratic presidential candidates' hypocrisy. All you have to do is look no further than their private jets. And it's interesting, this came out just as we were seeing this video of Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, kind of trying to hide from the camera as she got off of a private jet. He says, first of all, I have no problem with presidential candidates leasing private jets to get from one campaign stop to the next. That makes sense. But he said the problem is most of these Democratic candidates, those with enough funds, lease private jets to travel to their campaign events only to rail against the use of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide emissions and explain how, as president, they will force you to cut back. So you want some of the numbers? I'll just give you a few. The Sanders campaign, by the way, this comes from Bet Scher. He's the executive editor of the Washington Free Beacon. So they've looked up the numbers, and this is where they come from. According to Bashir, the Sanders campaign spent $1.2 million on private jet travel just in the last quarter. The company Sanders is leasing from claims it provides luxury private jet charter services. And so it's pretty nice if you're a wealthy socialist. Sanders is followed then by Joe Biden's campaign, which spent a little more than, again, $1 million on that. Elizabeth Warren, $750,000. Buttigieg, about $350,000. And so those are just some of the numbers that are on record. Of course, Michael Bloomberg is also flying around in private jets while he's lecturing all of us about climate change. His campaign said he spent $646,000, but I do have a question as to were some of his other activities not considered part of his campaign, but just part of his business, but he used it for campaign as well. So those numbers may be underreported. But you might say, well, I mean, you got to travel some way. What's wrong with a private jet? Well, it turns out that every study that's ever been done basically estimates that the per person carbon footprint by traveling on a private jet is about 10 times higher than from commercial travel. Now, again, I don't say that they shouldn't use the private jets, but I just think that the bottom line is that it just is a bit of hypocrisy. And the way some of them get around it, and I'll give the Sanders campaign at least trying to get around it, is they said, well, we bought carbon offsets. So the way we so-called mitigate against carbon use is buying carbon offsets of about $32,000. But it is something to think about. Some of the people lecturing you about your carbon footprint have a carbon footprint probably 10 times larger than yours. And it's just something to think about when they're telling us that we need to implement the Green New Deal. Let's take a break. When we come back, we've got a State of the Union address to address, and we'll talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed. thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. Last night, of course, was the third State of the Union address by Donald Trump. Only the second time that a sitting president has the cloud of impeachment over his head while giving that State of the Union address. And so we'll be talking about that. Many people have said that it's a little bit reminiscent of something Ronald Reagan called for back in 1975 at CPAC, in which you would have no pale pastels but bold colors, and certainly that was the case. And so we're going to give you a chance to certainly hear some of the speech last night. We're certainly going to give you a chance to comment about that as well. And then we'll get into, if we have some time, a few other things, because we do have, I think they're still counting, Penna Dexter with me, I think they're still counting votes there in Iowa, aren't they?
I think they are. I heard a news report on the way here that Joe Biden's counts are only maybe 1,000 more than Amy Klobuchar now. So it's like 13 point something and 12 point something percent of the vote. So, surprisingly enough, he may end up really doing badly in Iowa. But Kerby, thank you for inviting me today, because I'm so excited to talk about last night and the State of the Union, and really so many things converging today that are in the news that are interesting. And in a sense, for those of us who care about freedom, the sanctity of human life, religious liberty, there is sort of good days this week, and we can applaud some of that.
And again, we also have a vote taking place later today, we believe. All the senators come back at 4:00, and so we'll see what that is. So we have a lot of things to cover. But if nothing else, I certainly want to get into the State of the Union address. But excuse me, I gotta chair some things here real quickly. Just had to do that once. If nothing else, to get everybody laughing.
That was not a good look.
That was not a good look. Yeah, and as people have said before, the president could have shaken a hand. The president didn't have to call people names. We know that. But I can't remember a time when John Boehner tore up the speech of Barack Obama or Paul Ryan. I can't remember a time when a member of Congress walked out and then tweets why he's leaving. I do remember one member of Congress that sometimes said, "You lie," and he apologized and was pounced on. But it's getting a little rough in the House of Representatives now. We've always had kind of decorum, and I think it started off with Nancy Pelosi instead of "gives me the distinct pleasure." She didn't say any of those kinds of things. And
no personal pleasure there.
Yeah, it looks a little bit more like maybe British Parliament. So I want to get your comments about that as well. But if nothing else, this was a speech that really kind of tried to set forth the success of the Trump administration, but also was kind of poking some people in the chest a couple of times on everything from school choice to abortion to issues of sanctuary cities. You can go down a very long list, as we will. And I was pretty surprised at all the things that were said by Donald Trump. What are your thoughts?
I thought it was expertly put together, Kerby, because first of all, here we are on the eve of impeachment vote, probably being acquitted, but having gone through really 3 years of the attacks, and sort of culminating today, this afternoon. And he didn't mention it once. He did. There was one line that I thought referred to impeachment, and that was when he said the only victories that matter in Washington are the victories that deliver for the American people. I thought that was very tongue-in-cheek indictment of Congress for being sort of a do-nothing Congress, do nothing except impeachment.
That's for sure.
So that was great.
And I might just mention that in case you are following along, and we do want to open up the phones to get your comments, good, bad, or indifferent. The first article is a transcript of the State of the Union address. And if you print it out, make sure that you have a lot of paper because these things do take a lot.
77 minutes.
Yes. And we have also a section on fact-checking, which we'll be doing because some people have said, matter of fact, I think the Speaker of the House said the reason I tore it up is because he lied. And some of the things she said were lies. I'm not sure they are, but let's go and we'll get into those and see where they are. We also have some information about the impeachment vote, why it would be taking place today rather than last Saturday, and then at least one on the whole issue of late-term abortion. So those are some articles for you as well. But are you ready? I thought we'd play maybe a clip or two before we even take our first break. And first of all, you have the president, as you just mentioned, Penna, talking about the economy and really trying to give what he feels is his economic report.
I am thrilled to report to you tonight that our economy is the best it has ever been. Our military is completely rebuilt, with its power being unmatched anywhere in the world, and it's not even close. Our borders are secure. Our families are flourishing. Our values are renewed. Our pride is restored. And for all of these reasons, I say to the people of our great country and to the members of Congress, the state of our union is stronger than ever before.
Again, the president always loves the hyperbole. Most of the presidents say the State of the Union is strong, but no, State of the Union is stronger than ever before. But talks about the economy, talks about borders, talks about the military, and of course we'll go through all the different aspects of that. But that is kind of the opening line for a lot of presidents, and certainly that is exactly setting forth what he was going to say for the next 70-plus minutes.
Well, I thought it was good that he said it that way because I was kind of wondering how that was going to go over to say the state of our union is strong, considering it's very divided.
Yes.
But to say stronger than ever before, I think he was referring to a lot of things that are going to follow, the numbers he was going to give, the unprecedented, for instance, employment numbers for different demographics groups, including, African Americans and Hispanics and young African Americans. And these are all unprecedented records that have been set. So to say stronger than ever before was really not hyperbole. It wasn't over the top. It was really true on so many fronts.
And we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll play that clip because he goes into it, and some of these clips last for about a minute and a half. First of all, I want to thank Andrew for collecting these, but what we decided not to do is to take out the applause because sometimes we would shorten these. And then you think like people just went like that and that was it. And so I think it's better to hear it in its context. But then that brings us to one of the big fact check questions, which we'll talk about. I think it's number 3 in our list here. Okay, what about the so-called unemployment list and the employment rates and the issue of poverty and jobs and those kinds of things? So we're going to get into that in a little more detail so that you can check it for yourself, because there have been a lot of people doing some fact checking and I'm going, that's not really fair, or maybe he'll say 6,000 and they'll say something else, or there's been a little bit of debate about how many industries and manufacturing has been created. It's like, yeah, but he's within the order of magnitude, and if you use the numbers that the Department of Labor uses, then that's right. So in some cases, we want to be fair to the fact-checking, but at the same time recognize that some of the fact-checkers need to be fact-checked, don't they?
Some of them do, and I kind of compared the Washington Post, which I try to read every day, and the Daily Signal, which I read every day. And this, did you post this?
We did. This is one of the articles, so you can read it for yourself.
Because they did a complete job, I think, of bringing, the reasons and sort of the way these different statements were constructed and why they are as they are. So I think they did a good job, and it sounds like they're on these fronts. There's about 11, I think, that they've fact-checked he told the truth.
As far as I can tell. But again, some people might hear something different, so that's why you're tuning in to Point of View. So we're going to come back and talk about his jobs numbers and the unemployment numbers, and then we'll talk about, okay, were those accurate? And then we'll move on to criminal justice and USMCA and health care and a lot of others. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Members of the very popular South Korean boy band were denied draft exemptions even though it would reduce revenue to the country. Why? Because there aren't enough boys available to serve in the military. Lyman Stone uses this illustration to highlight the extremely low birth rate in South Korea. But that country is just one of many examples of what has become a global birth dearth. Fertility rates have been declining in all the developed countries of the world. The U.S. figures are better than in many countries in Europe and Asia, but still illustrate the decline. Fertility rates in this country declined from 2.1 children per woman in 2006 to 1.7 today. The figure might even drop lower if we hit another recession. Although legalized abortion, contraception, and down economy are often cited for the reasons for lower fertility, those factors only explain part of the decline. The U.S. first reached birth rates around 2 children per woman during the Roaring '20s, not during the Great Depression and long before contraceptive access was readily available. Modern economies depend on various transfers of wealth across generations. The obvious examples are Social Security and other so-called entitlement programs. An older generation also expects the younger generation to buy their houses and other assets, but that's not happening. Even the trade deficit is due in part to the fact that there are more assets than there are buyers to purchase them. The solution, it seems, is not to pass government policies that try to make people want to have children. The best that can be done would be to eliminate government policies that currently penalize couples with children. At the least, government should reduce the financial barriers for parents who want to bring kids into the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about the State of the Union address last night, and we're just going to play a few of the clips, but also along the way, we'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter with me, and so let's, if we can, go to the one you just mentioned, because he did talk about the jobs report and record low unemployment.
Since my election, we have created 7 million new jobs, 5 million more than government experts projected during the previous administration. The unemployment rate is the lowest in over half a century. And very incredibly, the average unemployment rate under my administration is lower than any administration in the history of our country. If we hadn't reversed the failed economic policies of the previous administration, the world would not now be witnessing this great economic success. The unemployment rate for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans has reached the lowest levels in history.
So again, just a little bit of a fact check. But first of all, you know, when you're first talking about creating new jobs, you would think that both sides of the aisle would stand up. I would think that if that had happened under the Obama administration, I hope the Republicans would stand up. But you had difficulty getting the Democrats to stand up, even when you're talking about creating new jobs. Now, but a little bit later when he says the failed economic policies, okay, I can see why they wouldn't stand up for that. But that's kind of interesting. But what about this idea, the lowest unemployment rates for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans? And we have in front of us, again, one of those fact checks that says, as far as we can tell, those are accurate numbers, all right?
And that's what's happened. Sometimes when you have decreases in unemployment or wage hikes, which both are the case right now, it's for the higher level employees. And this picture is a little bit different because you look at the lower waged employees, blue collar workers. He called it a blue collar boom. And so that, in a sense, it vindicates those who switched from voting Democrat to vote for Trump this time because they were in trouble. And there are a lot of people across the Midwest that are in that position. And now, you know, the Bidens of the world will try to appeal to them, but it sort of bodes well for President Trump for re-election, or at least for gaining even more of those voters if their situations are better. So, the numbers that, and people can look at the fact checking, but the numbers that he has provided do vindicate and really support the fact that unemployment is lower in all those different categories. And so for the Democrats to not stand up for that, I mean, they did stand up for a few things. They should have stood up for that.
Yeah. Well, another one was this issue of criminal justice. Now, if you had told me a couple of years ago that President Donald Trump would be leading the charge on criminal justice reform, I would say there is not a chance. And again, I recognize that some people might say, well, he's just doing that to get elected. And I recognize sometimes that's the case. Matter of fact, one of the Super Bowl ads involved this issue of criminal justice, and people were very critical of him. And there are all sorts of reasons why people say, well, maybe I won't vote for this president because he's a bully or he says all these kinds of things. But if you're looking at the issue of criminal justice reform, that was something else that was very intriguing. And I suspect we're going to hear a lot about it, if for no other reason than he spent millions of dollars for a Super Bowl commercial talking about criminal justice. Here's what he said.
Our roaring economy has, for the first time ever, given many former prisoners the ability to get a great job and a fresh start. This second chance at life is made possible because we passed landmark criminal justice reform into law. Everybody said that criminal justice reform couldn't be done, but I got it done, and the people in this room got it done.
So again, Donald Trump. Now, again, let's give the Kardashians some credit, especially in that ad. But nevertheless, again, this is something I did not see coming, and yet I saw, matter of fact, somebody saying it's hard to analyze this speech because it breaks all the categories. And I thought it did, because if you're looking at a Republican as only wanting to help the rich and only wanting to push grandma off the cliff and raid Social Security, he's talking about everything from paid leave to justice reform and a number of things, which, to be fair, you know, you had the Jack Kemps and others in the Republican Party talking about, but it's not something you normally identify with a Republican president.
He has broken a few categories. I will say it was sort of a bipartisan success that took place with criminal justice reform, with the First Step program. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are listening in Texas, and it happened here in Texas. It was sort of a model for what was done on the federal level. And I was at a conference a couple weeks ago at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and the lady, Alice Marie Johnson, who was in the ad, who Kim Kardashian helped, that she was released from prison. She's 63-year-old grandmother. She was granted clemency, and she was brought to President Trump's attention by Kim Kardashian. She told that story at the conference, and It was pretty cool to see that. And she's certainly been, a good sort of spokesperson for the president. She's been a success since she got out. She's now writing a book with Kim Kardashian. And so it just shows that, this president, he's not an ideologue in a sense. He's more of a practical guy.
Yeah.
And it's working for him. I mean, I disagree with some of those policies you just mentioned, like federal paid family leave. I don't think it's a good idea. And we can talk about why later or maybe another day. But he's a populist in that he looks at what's popular. He looks at how he's going to get votes. He does do that. For the most part, he's conservative, and he's really appealed to big sectors like the evangelicals by doing things that advance our interests. So he's been wise, he's been savvy and wily, and I think the other part of it is the optimism. And it's Reagan-esque in a sense. He's not like Reagan, but he's optimistic like Reagan. And the Democrats, they have to go in and they have to take malaise out of success. They have to reach down and try to find something to complain about to try to get elected right now. That's kind of where things are.
The argument that's been against him so far on the idea of criminal justice is, well, he's bringing families together, but he's tearing families apart. So they jump from the criminal justice question to immigration, which we are going to get to. But that's, in some respects, a category mistake. I mean, look at the criminal justice system. What else can we do in the criminal justice system? Something I've thought about because, first of all, we have a booklet on criminal justice. I even have a chapter in my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, on criminal justice and capital punishment and those kinds of things. And that is an issue that has certainly been a needed issue to be addressed. And
it still needs more addressing.
And there are some other things to be done. And we've had various people on this program, Star Parker and others, that have talked about the need to actually do this, because the original idea was, we need to be tough on crime. And that was really something that resonated in the 1990s. But then we started seeing people who 3 strikes and you're out get thrown in for life. And this poor woman that was actually released and was used in the Super Bowl ad basically assumed, after she really kind of got her life straight with the Lord, that she just spend the rest of her life ministering to other women. And 2 years ago during Super Bowl was in prison. And this one was actually in a commercial, which was used by the Trump administration to promote his reelection.
One of the ways in which it can be still improved is the fact that we have so many crimes where people don't know they're committing a crime.
Right.
I mean, I interviewed Harvey Silverglade on 3 felonies a day or something. I mean, you can be committing felonies and not even know it. So there's lots to be addressed in that sense. And, people can say, hey, I didn't think it was so bad that we got tougher on crime. And it wasn't. We always have to have a balance with things. But then, in certain cases, it was overkill. And that's why there's discretion, too, on the part of a president sometimes to grant clemency.
And again, I might just mention that if you go to the Heritage Foundation, they've got some good articles on the overcriminalization of America, because the point that Penna was making is you may be violating a federal crime right now and not even knowing it, because there are just so many on the books. When we come back from the break, NAFTA was a problem for candidate Donald Trump. So what did he do about it? Well, he got past USMCA, so we'll talk about that. Get into the military, get into education. We'll get into issues like religious liberty and abortion. But most importantly, let's open up the phones, get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter with me today, and we're doing kind of a roundtable, but as we give our opinions, we want to hear yours as well. 1-800-351-1212. We're talking about the State of the Union address, and if we have time, we'll get into some other topics. After all, a vote on impeachment today in the U.S. Senate. Always got lots to talk about. We will do so right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more, please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Penna Dexter with me, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Love to know your thoughts about the State of the Union address last night, and maybe even some of the reaction from different sides of the aisle, or as we'll talk about a little bit later, some of the individuals that were highlighted by the president, which I think was something that was quite unique and caused, Congressman Tim Ryan finally said, it's all fake, and walks out the door. And I've never seen that happen before either.
I think they thought they could do a lot of things that weren't very polite.
Yes, I guess. I don't know. And, of course, since Ronald Reagan's days, there have been people up there in the gallery that you highlight. And so we're a little bit later maybe talking about some of those individuals, including Rush Limbaugh, of course, was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer, but many others who, in one case, a brother who lost his brother because of sanctuary city policy, or a young daughter that wanted to go to school in Philadelphia, or a 21-week-old preemie that survived, and all sorts of things that we can talk about. But let's work our way through this, because one of those issues that a candidate Donald Trump spoke out against quite often is NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement. Now, he's replaced that with USMCA, which is the United States, Mexico, and Canada Agreement. There are some questions about that we've expressed on this program before, but I thought it would be good for just a minute to see what he would say about one of his signature pieces of legislation, and that is USMCA.
One of the biggest promises I made to the American people was to replace the disastrous NAFTA trade deal. In fact, unfair trade is perhaps the single biggest reason that I decided to run for president. Following NAFTA's adoption, our nation lost 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs. Many politicians came and went pledging to change or replace NAFTA, only to do so, and then absolutely nothing happened. But unlike so many who came before me, I keep my promises. We did our job. 6 days ago, I replaced NAFTA and signed the brand new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement into law. The USMCA will create nearly 100,000 new high-paying American auto jobs and massively boost exports for our farmers, ranchers, and factory workers.
So again, some of the statements by the president. What about this? Losing manufacturing jobs, losing factories. Again, we have some of this information that we've posted on fact checking, but what have we found out?
Well, on fact check, and the Poynter Institute is who they quote, that the United States has lost more than 60,000 factories since 2001. So from 2001 to 2017, when they did this report, more than 60,000 were lost. And Trump made a similar claim, they say, that was mentioned by PolitiFact, which also laid the blame on China joining the World Trade Association back in 2001. I remember us decrying that.
We talked about that here.
The decline in factories that took place. And now the numbers are that 60,000 were lost, 12,000 new ones have been gained back under Trump. And again, the Daily Signal gives the numbers, and it adds up. The differences add up. The first quarter of 2013, they say, saw the lowest number of factories, and that was during the Barack Obama years, I believe. Yes. Yeah. And then the number of factories began to increase during the final years of the Obama administration, and then dramatically increased since Trump has been elected.
Again, 343,000 to 356,000, and if my math is right, that's 12,000, and that's the number he gave us. So, again, just sometimes people, when they hear that, say, well, he's talking about, of course, obviously, when you start on 2017, then that's kind of where you start the number, and then where you are now 3 years later. I think that's how you fairly would do that, and again, I think the numbers add up.
And, under the Obama administration, the rhetoric was that we don't need these manufacturing jobs, yes, that we'll be more of a service-oriented country. It's better to send it overseas. That's been the whole idea of globalization. And for some companies, it works. For some people, it works. But it was such a dramatic change It hurts so many people in our country, and it's not necessarily that we should not be a manufacturing country. There are many industries where it's very appropriate for manufacturing to be done here in the U.S.
That certainly is, and we're seeing some of those jobs coming back. Let's keep moving down the road because I wanted to get into some other aspects of the State of the Union address. One of those is the military, and that was interesting. He did talk about the military. At the very end, we'll talk about the war on terror. But this one I don't think was that controversial, but he did make a point about the fact that we've spent more money in the military.
To safeguard American liberty, we have invested a record-breaking $2.2 trillion in the United States military. We have purchased the finest planes, missiles, rockets, ships, and every other form of military equipment, and it's all made right here in the USA. We are also getting our allies, finally, to help pay their fair share.
And again, getting into NATO and the military and the rest, I said it wasn't controversial in the terms of the numbers because I think everybody agrees $2.2 trillion. But it is controversial because as I'm listening to some of the Democratic candidates, they're saying we should not be spending this kind of military funds. We should not be involved in nation creating. And actually, the president sounds like he wants to pull back even more. So it's going to be hard for whether it's Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren or whoever it might be, to say, I disagree with the way the government has been spending money, since some of them, of course, voted for it in the first place.
Some of the things that he did mention, it wasn't in that clip, but ISIS was basically defeated. Mm-hmm. And this is in the fact check. 3 years ago, the barbarians of ISIS, he says, over 20,000 miles of territory in Iraq and Syria. They held that. And today it's been 100% destroyed. More than 20,000 square miles now have been, in Syria, have been liberated from ISIS. And then, of course, the discussion of the two terrorist leaders, al-Baghdadi and also Soleimani, who have been also eliminated. And the fact that he brought out the one family, Army Staff Sergeant Christopher Hake, I think you pronounce it, killed in Iraq by a roadside bomb, and showed his wife. And of course, those roadside bombs were the creation of Soleimani and his underlings.
Since you had that one, let's jump ahead to clip number 11, because that's about the military and terrorism.
The U.S. military executed a flawless precision strike that killed Soleimani and terminated his evil reign of terror forever. Our message to the terrorists is clear. You will never escape American justice. If you attack our citizens, you forfeit your life.
So again, some of the comments by, of course, President Trump. And you might remember when Barack Obama was running for re-election, one of the ideas is Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive. I don't think they're going to say that we killed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Qasem Soleimani, but it's something that he has mentioned. And he did, of course, spend actually about 2 or 3 sentences talking about it in the State of the Union address.
He did, and this was another one that was not widely applauded by some part, especially Soleimani. A lot of the Democrats can't bring themselves to be happy about his elimination.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, Penna and I have a few there where we have some disagreements with the president. One of those is on education, and the other on health care, so we're going to get into that. And then we'll get into, probably in the next hour, some of the others that were definitely those that were supportive by various pro-life, pro-family groups with comments he's made about everything from abortion to religious liberty. Of course, we'll get into Second Amendment on some of the others. So those are some topics that certainly we have yet to cover. And we'll also talk about some of the individuals that were featured by the president. But if you'd like to join the conversation and make a comment about the State of the Union address, let's open up the phones. Open line, 1-800-351-1212. What are your thoughts about the speech? What are your thoughts about some of the reaction to it? And if nothing else, I'd love to get your comments about our attempt to try to occasionally fact-check this. For no other reason, I try to be fair, whether it's Barack Obama or certainly some of the others that have spoken in the past. We've tried to do this with George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and, of course, now with Donald Trump. And that gives you a chance to at least understand that sometimes a little bit of hyperbole exists in a speech, but sometimes there's a reason for those numbers that were given. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the things that we thought we might focus on is the subject of education for just a minute. And that was preceded by Senator Tim Scott and Kirsten Sinema actually have worked together on what are called opportunity zones. And to more importantly, as we get into this issue of education, you're going to hear the name, and in case you did not hear the State of the Union address, one of the individuals that was highlighted by the president had to do with Janiyah Davis. Now, she's a fourth grader from Philadelphia, and he used the example of saying that the Pennsylvania governor actually vetoed an increase in the charter school scholarships. So then he awarded a scholarship to her right there. I was amazed at the number of things he did there, including giving Rush Limbaugh the award right there in front of all the people. You're going to be watching it right now. We're not going to invite you to another ceremony. You're going to be in the midst of the ceremony right now. And so one of the things he did was actually award the scholarship to Janiah Davis, right?
Yeah, that was cool. You know, it's funny. I was talking to someone here in the studio before the show about how I used to think that all these guests at State of the Union address were a little gimmicky. But they've come to the point where it's done every time. They are so well chosen. They were this time, and they almost become the heart of the speech. They almost move it along, and they certainly were used well this time. This one particular gift of a scholarship to a young black girl who hadn't gotten one from her state was pretty cool, I thought. We can talk a little bit later about the idea of federal support of school choice and state support of school choice and what really is probably the best there. But do we have a clip on that?
We do.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, you're going to hear her name, so I just wanted you to know who she was. A little bit later, we'll talk about Colonel McGee, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we're going to talk about Juan Guaido, who, of course, should be the duly elected president of Venezuela, and we'll talk about Ellie
That
Schneider.
one was a big shock to see him there.
Oh, sure was. And then poor Ellie Schneider wanted to go to bed, but she was the one that was born after 21 weeks and less than a pound. But let's get back to this. As we go to this, you'll hear him refer to her name and also talk about something that he wants to do in the field of education.
Now I call on Congress to give 1 million American children the same opportunity Janiah has just received. Pass the Education Freedom Scholarships and Opportunities Act, because no parent should be forced to send their child to a failing government school.
So there you are. Again, the Education Freedom Scholarship and Opportunity Act. Now, again, this is one place where around the table we say, I don't know, at a time when the federal government is $23 trillion in debt and we want to provide more scholarships, isn't it possible that we could say, okay, maybe there are scholarships that could be encouraged by the private sector or all sorts of things? Do we just always want to have the government step in every time on the field of education? And, of course, that's just one of those issues that has been promoted by the president and even by the Secretary of Education. And even though we certainly like Nancy DeVos,
Betsy DeVos,
I got to do a Nancy as well. Betsy DeVos, we certainly recognize the importance of education, but at the same time, why should the federal government be the primary provider of some of that? And Penna, you've got some more thoughts about that.
Well, this bill he talked about, and Ted Cruz has, I think he introduced this bill. It's called the Education Freedom Scholarships and Opportunity Act, helping workers and families, and it is tax credits for donations to state-run educational scholarships. So it's state-run scholarships, but they're federal tax credits, and that's where the cost comes into the federal government. And so it's a school choice bill. And the whole idea of school choice has been a theme for President Trump. Betsy DeVos was certainly appointed Secretary of Education for her work in that area. And so it's a good idea. School choice is definitely a good idea.
Yes.
And especially when you're looking at the people that are stuck in these terrible schools. But the idea, and this is pointed out by Lindsay Burke, who's the education point person at Heritage Foundation, in their piece, which analyzes the issues. And that is that a new federal tax credit scholarship program is already going to make the tax code more complex.
Yes.
It's going to be a new program that would eclipse state authority over K through 12 education. Education is a state issue and a local issue. So when we start bringing it back to the federal level, it's problematic. And so in this case, I think it'd be better for the federal government to encourage the states in this area and not to necessarily think they have to provide these federal tax credits for it, but encourage states and not step in that example that was given about Pennsylvania. It was a federal government. The idea is for them to step in and overrule what the state decided. We may not agree with what the state decided, but I think for those of us who are more just sort of inclined towards supporting state power and states' rights, I don't know that this bill is the best idea.
And again, this is a good example that cuts across both sides, because who's against education? I don't know, maybe the few of us around the table that say education is important, but at a time when the federal government is spending so much money and has so many mandates, this is part of the other problem, which we've talked about with previous administrations. It didn't start with Barack Obama. It probably started all the way back to George Herbert Walker Bush, and then was increased even more under Bill Clinton, even increased more under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Now we find ourselves in a situation the federal government is so much more involved, and it's kind of what I always call the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so if you're going to receive these federal grants, or if they are going to provide things through the Freedom Scholarships and Opportunity Act, then you have to follow all of these rules, mandates, and everything else. And right now, some people might say, well, I kind of agree with Ted Cruz, or I kind of agree with Donald Trump. Maybe some of our listeners don't, but maybe they say, in the past I agreed with Barack Obama. But the bottom line is that sooner or later you're going to have somebody in there that's going to put in mandates you really don't want. And that's one of the reasons why, again, let's just keep the federal government out of this and let state and local agencies make those decisions. The closer to the parents whose kids are being educated, the better. And the more bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. make those decisions, the problems that certainly ensue.
It's more efficient the closer it gets to the student. It's also better because it pertains to what's going on in that state, and much more efficient because every time you have a new program, you need new bureaucrats at the federal level, and you have to pay them. So it becomes more expensive. But here's what Lindsay Burke says when she sums this up. The goal of conservative policymakers should be to significantly narrow rather than broaden Washington's reach in education policy. Unfortunately, this proposal goes in the wrong direction.
Yes. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of your phone calls. I see a call or two coming in, but there is room for you. We'll come back. I'll get to one of the most controversial things said last night by Donald Trump, which is one of the reasons why I think Nancy Pelosi decided to tear it up, and that is the argument that over 130 legislators in this chamber have endorsed legislation that would bankrupt our nation and actually provide taxpayer-funded health care to millions of illegal aliens. So we'll talk about that, and that certainly was one of the more controversial statements by the president last night, so we'll talk about that. Also controversial, at least to those who are not pro-life, were the statements he made about abortion. And one of the articles we have here is a nice summary of the story of the birth of Ellie Schneider, a baby that was born at 21 weeks, 6 days, weighing less than a pound, and yet survived. And so first, it gets
she was
everybody
there that night, wiggling in her mother's arms, not too happy.
She was ready for nighty night. I know, that's for sure. I saw somebody on Twitter saying, it's 10 o'clock, put that girl to bed. But first of all, he kind of tricked him because he said, I asked Congress to provide another $50 million to fund neonatal research. Everybody stands up. And then right away he says, and that's why I'm also calling for members of Congress to pass legislation banning the late-term abortion of babies. Oops. A few of the Democrats couldn't find their seats fast enough. So we'll talk about that.
But it was a logical progression.
It was. And we'll talk about religious liberty, and we'll get into Second Amendment. So we've just got lots to cover. But at the same time, we also want to get your comments as well. 1-800-351-1212. We come back. I'll take some calls first before we hear from the president. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
So the verdict is ours to render under our Constitution. The people will judge us for how well and faithfully we fulfill our duty. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. Once again, we are talking about the State of the Union address, and if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter here as well. Let's take some phone calls, and then we'll get into the whole issue of health care, immigration, abortion, religious liberty, and guns. That's this hour. And then maybe some other issues. I also hear that at least one Republican is going to vote to remove the president from office. So we'll talk about that when we get some of that information in just a minute. But let's go to the phones first of all, and we'll head to North Carolina, WLGP. Andrea, thank you for calling today.
Well, good to hear your voice again. And I'm going to say, number one, you wanted some input. Fact-finding is excellent. I appreciate how you show that the numbers add up, because numbers by themselves don't work, do they?
Nope. Got to find out if they've been telling the
growth,
truth. Go ahead.
Checked it all out, and that was the first thing. Manufacturing jobs are up, job growth is up, unemployment is down. And I wanted to speak to his presence on the National Mall, with the pro-life march. I thought that was good and strong, because he's been there and other presidents were not there, right?
First president to actually be there on site at the March for Life. And I think that was a big sort of a booster for the pro-lifers who've been working for decades. And now you can see light at the end of the tunnel, can't you, Andrea?
Yes. And even the vice president and his wife sent a video from the Vatican.
So very good. Well, again, the March for Life is one of those issues. We'll get to the issue of abortion in just a minute. Now, there's some that say, well, we do still need to defund Planned Parenthood, and I wish there was some way they could figure that out without threatening the closing down of the government, because we know that's what the trick is used on the other side. But we'll get back to that in just a minute. One of the issues we talked about is education and school choice. So I want to go to Missouri, KTTK. Don, I think you wanted to address that issue. And since we just a minute ago were talking about education, love to hear your comments.
Yes, I'm in rural Missouri, and I'm not going to name any schools, but our grandchildren goes to a school with a pretty bad drug epidemic, and STDs are running about 23-24% in the high school students now. They're admitting that.
Wow.
And we'd like our lower grade grandchildren to go to another school, and the parents would too. But they don't want us to do that. The teachers' unions, say the school would lose a lot of money by being able to transfer, to another school. Right now, if they go to another school, it's about $7,800 to pay tuition plus, our own transportation to send them to a different district. But what the teachers' unions don't say is we're still paying property taxes, even if they lose the state and federal money that goes with that student from one school to another. Our district is still getting the property taxes from us, which is a substantial amount,
So do you have to, are you talking about moving them from one public school to another public school?
Yes, even to, you talk about school choice, but even for us to try to move them from our district that is having these problems to another neighboring district, which is not too far away, we would have to be, at least take the children to a bus stop, and we would have to pay $7,800 tuition for them to go to a school that is better quality education. But our district still gets our property tax money, which is,
That's
a
right.
large piece of our money. So they play that game how they're hurting if they let us have school choice, even from public school to public school. But they don't lose that much money.
Let me just mention, too, I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but I did a commentary, and it was on December 20th on charter schools. And the reason I did that is because originally you had some Democratic presidential candidates saying charter schools are good. Then they got to Joe Biden and a few others and go, nope. And you go, well, really, as you said, Penna, you're going from one public school to another public school. There is a difference between a public school and a charter school, but they're still the public school. Well, yeah, but the bottom line is the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers don't like that because only about 11% of those charter schools are unionized. And so in some respects you go, I don't understand why this is an issue if you're moving from one public school to another public school, unless you understand there's some other issues involved. And, of course, the real school choice would be providing to be able to move to from a public school to a private school or a Christian school or something like that. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. And so when all this was said about education, I watched very carefully to see if anybody on the Democratic side stood up. None of them did, because they recognize how influential the National Education Association is at the Democratic National Convention.
But it's for some of the constituencies of the Democrats, the African Americans that are stuck in the inner city schools. School choice would be really one of the only hopes for success for a lot of these kids.
Right.
And, you know, with private donations, with states doing things for school choice, there's a Supreme Court case now that's, you know, could help the school choice movement if it goes the right way. That is such a light at the end of the tunnel, such a bright spot for those kids to give them hope, where they really, I mean, some of these schools are really bad. You can't really learn anything because it's mostly dealing with behavior.
Again, I have the DVD, which you can watch, Waiting for Superman. I think it's now even on YouTube, just seeing these parents just hoping they might win the lottery to be able to move their kid from one school to the next. And so since we're talking about education, let's take another phone call just before we take a break here. KCTA in Texas. Susan, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, Kirby, I had a little experience with this when Hillary Clinton woke up one morning and decided she would send her idea about school curriculum to the school agencies like the TEA, the Texas Education Agency, and called it a mandate. There is no such thing as a federal mandate for local education. And our TEA and even the school districts, instead of saying, thank you for your suggestion, but the parents who are paying for the schools want that in the curriculum. The specific thing I'm talking about that I got to find out about at a school meeting was entering scientific method and a lab, you know, where you dissect animals and learn anatomy and physiology and scientific method in the curriculum. It was completely missing in the educational lesson plan. And I was able to be there with a friend of mine who was a teacher, and I said, well, where is the scientific method? Where is the lab? And everybody said, shh, no, you don't say that. It's mandated that we take it out. And so they pretended that they had to do that because they called it a mandate, where the parents who pay for the schools and are responsible for the education of their children want them to learn how to think rationally and scientifically in their science classes.
Sure. Well, we have to take a break, but I'm thinking maybe we have to have Penna Dexter do another education program here because this has been a hot topic. So we will continue on after the break because I do want to finish off a few other comments by the president, not the least of which is his argument that there were 130 legislators endorsing legislation that would bankrupt the government and actually require taxpayer-funded health care to illegal aliens. Then we'll get to abortion and religious liberty. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Members of the very popular South Korean boy band were denied draft exemptions even though it would reduce revenue to the country. Why? Because there aren't enough boys available to serve in the military. Lyman Stone uses this illustration to highlight the extremely low birth rate in South Korea. But that country is just one of many examples of what has become a global birth dearth. Fertility rates have been declining in all the developed countries of the world. The U.S. figures are better than in many countries in Europe and Asia, but still illustrate the decline. Fertility rates in this country declined from 2.1 children per woman in 2006 to 1.7 today. The figure might even drop lower if we hit another recession. Although legalized abortion, contraception, and down economy are often cited for the reasons for lower fertility, those factors only explain part of the decline. The U.S. first reached birth rates around 2 children per woman during the Roaring '20s, not during the Great Depression and long before contraceptive access was readily available. Modern economies depend on various transfers of wealth across generations. The obvious examples are Social Security and other so-called entitlement programs. An older generation also expects the younger generation to buy their houses and other assets, but that's not happening. Even the trade deficit is due in part to the fact that there are more assets than there are buyers to purchase them. The solution, it seems, is not to pass government policies that try to make people want to have children. The best that can be done would be to eliminate government policies that currently penalize couples with children. At the least, government should reduce the financial barriers for parents who want to bring kids into the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter with me. And I thought we might as well, we postponed it long enough, the most controversial issue of the night, at least it was the one that Nancy Pelosi used as a justification for tearing up the speech, was this idea of 130 legislators in the chamber endorsing legislation that would bankrupt the nation. It also would require that for those individuals that are here illegally to receive health care. So let's, if we can, go to that very controversial statement by President Donald Trump.
But as we work to improve Americans' health care, there are those who want to take away your health care, take away your doctor, and abolish private insurance entirely. 132 lawmakers in this room have endorsed legislation to impose a socialist takeover of our health care system, wiping out the private health insurance plans of 180 million very happy Americans. To those watching at home tonight, I want you to know we will never let socialism destroy American health care.
So again, there you go. A fair number of boos, which after a while started sounding more like the British Parliament, where if you've ever watched some of those, they'll boo all the time. But nevertheless, what about this? Because again, we have an opportunity. I think it's point number 8 here in terms of fact checks. So what have we found out here?
Well, there was a debate, and a lot of people remember this, among the Democrat presidential candidates back in 2019 in June. Where they were asked about whether they supported taxpayer-funded health care for illegal immigrants, and they all raised their hands. So if anybody's trying to say there's not support for that among the Democrats, there is. I guess it was 130 who actually voted for legislation that would provide that. I don't know about that particular piece of legislation. It wasn't mentioned in this fact check.
They did a little bit of number 7 there, talked a little bit about that. And again, first of all, let's start in the Senate side, because you had Bernie Sanders introducing Medicare for all. And so that was Bernie Sanders plus 13 others. So there's 14 there. And then, of course, if you look at then those in the House,
I mean, AOC loves Medicare for all.
So there you go. So I think that's how that number comes up. So for those of you that say, okay, that one was controversial, he got all sorts of boos, that was the one that everybody camped out on, both fact check number 7 and 8 on our website. You can read it. And again, this comes from our good friends at Daily Signal, Fred Lucas and Jarrett Stepman and others that we've had on the program talking about that. So that is the case. Before we get to the one on abortion, I thought maybe I'd just give you kind of the list. We've already talked about Stephanie and Janiah Davis from Philadelphia, and that was on education. And then I thought we did mention Kelly and Gage Hake and the story of the late Army Sergeant Christopher Hake. I did mention briefly the Tuskegee Airman Charles McGee, who then not only was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, but also served his country with distinction. I think it was in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, if I remember right. Then you had his great-grandson, who got introduced first, an aspiring astronaut, 8th grader from Scottsdale. That was pretty cute. And then you have, of course, Carl and Marcia Mueller, a tribute to their daughter, Kayla. Of course, we've mentioned before, but let's mention for sure that Rush Limbaugh received the Medal of Freedom right in front of everybody. And then the one that I wanted to get to, and that is Robin Schneider and her daughter Ellie, born at 21 weeks. And one of the articles we've posted goes into that in more detail, because when you go into that, again, survives. I've just always been amazed at the advancement in neonatology. It is just amazing to me. 21 weeks, 6 days, weighs less than a pound. And she survived because of the skill of the doctors, the prayer of her parents, and she won the battle of life, and used that really to talk about the idea of life being sacred.
Yes. He promised $50 million for neonatal research, and as you said, he got a standing ovation from both sides. And then immediately upon that, he called for the passage of, it's the Pain Capable Unborn Child Act, really. It's a bill that puts a lot of teeth into the ban on partial birth abortion and late-term abortion. And so he just made that logical step so seamlessly from a child who we go all out to save that child. At 21 weeks, she was born. That's very early. And she was wiggling. She looked like she was about 2 or something like that, and probably needed to go to bed. And there she was, healthy and beautiful. And just making that step very quickly, some of them probably had to sit down very quickly, because they would then be applauding a ban on late-term abortion. And many Democrats just cannot bring themselves to do that.
So let's hear what he had to say.
That is why I'm also calling upon members of Congress here tonight to pass legislation finally banning the late-term abortion of babies. Whether we are Republican, Democrat, or Independent, surely we must all agree that every human life is a sacred gift from God.
So again, and he's saying whether you're Republican or Democrat, I've already had a chance to read Penna Dexter's commentary, which we'll be talking about on Friday when you're part of the weekend edition that we will do. And of course, that was led by a Democrat in Louisiana. But it's harder and harder, as you know, to find pro-life Democrats, isn't it?
It's harder to, really be in that party and be pro-life. But, every human life is a sacred gift from God. And, here I'm looking at you, Nancy Pelosi, and all of those others who say they're Catholic and believe in God, and yet just are so supportive of, they call it choice, we call it abortion.
Yeah.
And so I love that we have a president that's just very vocal about the sanctity of human life. And you look, he's got this big family, and it's just sort of lives it. So that was, I think if you asked me to choose a moment, I did love Rush Limbaugh getting the Medal of Freedom, but I think that was my favorite moment of the night.
Yes, and again, that every human life is a sacred gift from God. Before we get to the issue of religious liberty, we got a call here that kind of ties in the education discussion to the one we're going to have on religious liberty. So let's head out to Arizona. Donna, thank you for calling. I think you want to ask a question, so you have the floor. What would you like to ask?
Okay, thank you. My question is, why is it so hard? Shouldn't it be really simple to give whatever government funding each child gets? Their school gets that funding. Why can that not go to the parents? Parents can make their choice for the school that they want and then add to it if it costs more than that.
And the argument that I would make for this is that when we had the so-called GI Bill, that is individuals that served, for example, in World War II, and they came back, they were given the opportunity as a voucher, and they could spend it if they wanted to go to Notre Dame or Georgetown, which are kind of Catholic schools, or if they wanted to go what later came to be known as Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, or if they wanted to go to Arizona State, or they wanted to go to Colorado University, or whatever it might be. In every particular case, we're talking about the fact that you have the freedom. Now, the argument, Penn, as you well know, is the National Education Association and the National Federation of Teachers recognize if we have that kind of free choice, the private schools probably would do a lot better, and the public schools would not do quite so well, right? Because
the teachers' unions are so powerful. I think they stand between, it's the money following the child.
Yes.
It makes perfect logical common sense, but we just have a lot of forces mitigating against it that are very powerful.
And since we don't have Kelly Shackelford here, I'll put on my Kelly Shackelford-like hat and not even claim to be as smart as he is. But we talked about the Blaine Amendment last week, and the Blaine Amendment is up front and center right now out of a case out of Montana. Now, the Blaine Amendment came from a representative who was using this to basically not fund the Catholic schools. So it really had an anti-Catholic bias at its start, but it's now been used to say you can't use money for sectarian purposes. And the case out of Missouri, out of Montana, I should say, is one that actually has a woman that, given her name, I think is Hispanic, but wanted to use it for a Christian school, and they were prevented from being able to use that. Now they've since gotten rid of that scholarship, so the Supreme Court could just simply say, well, it's not a big issue anymore, but I'm hoping they'll use that to rule against the Blaine Amendment. So there have been some attempts to prevent any kind of funding to go to religious schools, so that's been a secondary kind of legal argument against it. But Donna, once again, you're using common sense, and sometimes we just don't have common sense in the federal government. We come back, we're going to talk about religious liberty, and we haven't talked about the Second Amendment. Donald Trump did. We will too, right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, Penna Dexter with me as well, and we'll look at just a few more things said by the President during the State of the Union address, and then recognize that we are about ready to have, in the next couple of hours, possibly a vote on whether to remove the President on those articles of impeachment. And a little bit of a surprise, because at least one Republican looks like he wants to remove the President. I wondered whether some of the Democrats would vote against that. Certainly Senator Manchin or Sinema or Jones, but we'll see.
I noticed Kristen Sinema standing and applauding many of the lines of the president. She was not dressed in white like many of the women were in the House. She was in the front, and she had this bright blue dress, and she stood up for many of the president's. I don't know if she's pro-life or not, but she certainly is more conservative economically. She's from Arizona. I think it's John McCain's old seat that she won.
And Tim Scott is somebody that she's worked with.
Yes.
And so, especially when his name was mentioned, she stood up. So we'll see where any of those three Democrats, or now this one Republican, votes, and maybe another one, so we'll find out. But the president kind of sometimes would jump from one topic to the other. 1 minute he's talking about First Amendment, the next minute he's talking about Second Amendment. I think he needed a transition, but that's okay. Here we really have one that pulls together both religious liberty and guns.
My administration is also defending religious liberty, and that includes the constitutional right to pray in public schools. In America, we don't punish prayer. We don't tear down crosses. We don't ban symbols of faith. We don't muzzle preachers and pastors. In America, we celebrate faith. We cherish religion. We lift our voices in prayer, and we raise our sights to the glory of God. Just as we believe in the First Amendment, we also believe in another constitutional right that is under siege all across our country. So long as I am president, I will always protect your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms.
So again, First Amendment, Second Amendment. But that one on the First Amendment, Kelly sent me something, said, they mentioned our case. You know, we do not tear down crosses.
It seemed like they mentioned two cases, because they talked about
the prayer.
And you pray in school, and you're not going to be punished for that, which Coach Kennedy was. And then, of course, the big victory, the Bladensburg Cross, Peace Cross. I mean, Kelly was in the Oval Office. Two of his cases were highlighted there in that Religious Freedom Day. And it just makes me so proud of First Liberty Institute and the work they've done.
For sure.
And when you see it paying off, and, you know, of course, part of the reason it pays off is because of who the president has nominated as judges, which was another wonderful victory that he could talk about. And who's been confirmed by the Senate.
Yes. I might just mention real quickly while we're talking about religious liberty, because we won't have Kelly with us on Friday, but with us will be Jeremy, so maybe we'll talk about that. But Ken Blackwell, who's been on the program with us before, wrote this piece about religious freedom, and I really appreciate that because, first of all, our friends in Ohio know who he is, but also he's been a board member of the American Civil Rights Union, not to be confused with the American Civil Liberties Union, but this is one that's very pro-religious liberty, also an ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And he points out that, you know, after the Constitution was ratified, James Madison drafted the Bill of Rights, and he says it's no accident that the First Amendment was in there, but then points out that even though we may say that there are some times when things like they want to tear down the cross, or there's been some criticism of Christians, when you talk about religious liberty, Ken Blackwood points out the fact that the religious hate crimes have increased. But it isn't because they've increased for people that are Christian or Muslim. It's because they've increased because of anti-Semitic violence. And that these are, in many cases, happening in some of the most liberal cities, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And the Anti-Defamation League says, you know, we're not just talking about vandalism, because most of the problems that Christians or Muslims have run into in terms of religious hate crimes have been slurs, vandalism, things like that, at houses of worship. with the Anti-Defamation League, they said that over 7,000 of these have been anti-Semitic violence. So it's kind of one of those big issues that we're going to have to address here in the country. And then if I can continue on, since he also, of course, has been in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, then he starts looking at the International Religious Freedom Report and looking at all those countries where religious liberty has been attacked. And he uses some examples like Nigeria or Burma, or oftentimes referred to as Myanmar, Iran, and, of course, North Korea. And so it really makes the case, in case you want to find his column today, Religious Freedom, an Inconvenient Right to American Progressives, that whether in this country or other countries, one of the best arguments, even for an atheist, is to say, you may not care about our religious liberty, but look at what happens in other countries where once you lose your religious liberty, you lose a lot of other liberties as well. So pay attention to what is happening, because one of the first things to get attacked are usually religious ideas, because if you want the state to be sovereign, you can't have a God being sovereign.
Mm-hmm. And so, the push for socialism plays into that too. And I want to add, too, that I thought that was a very powerful theme in the speech.
It's one that's been quoted, I've noticed, on Twitter more than any other.
Yeah.
We do not punish prayer. We do not tear down crosses. We do not ban symbols of faith. We do not muzzle preachers and pastors. In America, we celebrate faith.
And he talked about the glory of God.
Yes, just incredible.
Sometimes I wonder if, people criticize evangelicals for supporting Trump because of things in his past, but they're around him in the White House. They meet with him. They support him. He promotes policies that help evangelicals. And, I do pray for the president every day, and I wonder sometimes if some of it rubs off.
Yes, you do wonder. Again, some of these speeches and some of these lines remind you of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and again, some of these lines have been used as well by Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. I'm not saying this just to Republicans, but it is kind of intriguing.
I can't imagine Barack Obama talking about the glory of God.
You're reaching a little bit there, I guess, for sure. But I'm trying to be fair. But again, there's right. There are some things here that even if you told me that the president or the candidate, Donald Trump, 4 years ago would be saying this, I just would not have believed it.
I wouldn't have either.
And I got to get to one more since we're talking about religion. How about Israel? We did talk about the fact that there is an attempt to come up with another peace process, and we did have a pretty good, robust discussion with Kelly Shackelford and Dr. Merrill Matthews. But again, one of the other things he talked about is not only fighting Islamic terrorism, but also, in a sense, trying to bring peace in the Middle East.
My administration is also strongly defending our national security and combating radical Islamic terrorism. Last week, I announced a groundbreaking plan for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Recognizing that all past attempts have failed, we must be determined and creative in order to stabilize the region and give millions of young people the chance to realize a better future.
And again, when he actually had that announcement of the prime minister there, Benjamin Netanyahu, said, "You're the best friend that Israel has ever had." And when you think about some of those other people that would have also qualified as being one of the best friends of Israel, that, again, is something I wouldn't have predicted a couple of years ago.
No, we wouldn't have predicted that.
So anyway, those are just a few of the various statements by the president in terms of the State of the Union.
He spoke for 77 minutes, so we couldn't do all of it.
But we gave you a pretty good overview, and if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to fact-check a few of those, which we didn't have a chance to cover, there are 11 in this fact-checking of the Trump State of the Union address that we've posted on there as well. We covered most of this. We didn't even get into the issue of oil and natural gas, and a couple of the others that are sort of part and parcel of that as well. But we covered most of those and tried to help you understand a little bit more about what the president said and how that fits up with some of those facts. And if you thought that was helpful, you might leave us a comment on Facebook or somewhere else and say, I appreciate that, because we can do those kinds of things again with other speeches. And certainly after we start getting into some of these debates, we want to do some fact checking on that as well. Speaking of the debate, I guess Mike Bloomberg is going to be in the next debate before New Hampshire, and it's something the Democrats have been complaining about, that he bought his way onto that. Over the next day or two, maybe we'll actually get final numbers for Iowa. But when we come back, we are just about ready to convene in a formal sense the final hours, I suspect, of the impeachment trial. Yes, there have been speeches given over time, but in just about 15 or 20 minutes, they will actually convene again where the Chief Justice will be there. There'll be some resolutions, and then I suspect there will be a vote. I know that there will be attempts by the Democrats to postpone that for hours, but maybe before this day is over, we'll have a decision as to whether or not the president will be removed from office. I think we know the answer to that, but there have been some surprise comments, and so we're going to play one of those right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, the Iowa caucus is over, and maybe the votes will come in. We'll announce those tomorrow. But people were also counting some other votes and wondering of some of the Democrats, would any of them vote against removal? Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Senator Doug Jones from Alabama, or, of course, one that we've been talking about, Senator Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. But there's always been the question as to whether or not Senator Mitt Romney from Utah, a Republican, would vote to actually remove the president from office. Of course, the vote hasn't happened, but here's what Senator Romney just said.
So the verdict is ours to render under our Constitution. The people will judge us for how well and faithfully we fulfill our duty. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine.
So again, Senator Mitt Romney is going to vote to remove the president from office because of that. It's
amazing. The Wall Street Journal today has an article about Susan Collins from Maine.
Right.
And she famously voted, of course, for the need for more witnesses. But she's going to vote to acquit Trump in the Senate. And yet Mitt Romney, it's surprising that, he's from a very conservative state, that he is doing this. And I think back on the fact that he could have been president of the United States himself. And would there have been, I don't think that the Democrats would have gone after him the way they've gone after Trump, because he's a little more moderate in his demeanor. He doesn't have a lot to go after in a sense. But what could they have found? What could they have found that they could have spun to try to impeach him?
Just remember the campaign where they talked about having the dog on the top of the car and about supposedly beating up a kid and then having a notebook full of women, that he could interview. And I mean, they really were reaching on every single one of those issues. But nevertheless, I mean, he was not exactly well treated by some of the people that are actually going to vote to remove the president from office. We do know and maybe in some respects he says, well, I can do this because it won't have any consequences. But it does make it kind of interesting, because if Joe Manchin and Doug Jones and Kirsten Sinema all vote for that, then of course you're up to 48, and then you could get with Mitt Romney, 49 if I'm counting right. Maybe I'm missing one, but it just seems to me that makes it look worse than it was. And nothing of the sort happened even under Bill Clinton, and nothing of the sort has ever happened before until you go all the way back to the 19th century when they were trying to get rid of Andrew Johnson, and then it was one vote that kept him from being removed from office, which was, again, perhaps the most political up until now impeachment that's ever taken place. I didn't see that coming, but there it is.
I really am a little, I guess we shouldn't be shocked, because his rhetoric has been very, very consistent all along, but I am shocked that this is actually going to happen. I guess on Friday I'll be here and we'll have some fun talking about what went down this afternoon, and so that ought to be just something else interesting to talk about.
I would say so. Since we've got a few minutes left, let's talk about that. We did have an Iowa caucus, still don't have the numbers, and I thought Pete Buttigieg actually declared victory on Monday night when we had no numbers. But also, it I think is something that even Gary Bauer was pointing out. I mean, after all these months of campaigning and millions of dollars and everything, the Iowa Democratic Party proved that it was a little bit on the incompetent side. And his line was, we've used this before, the party that fashions itself as a party of science, that thinks more government is the solution, that believes it can tell the temperature of the entire planet 100 years from now, and thinks that it can make a better healthcare decision for you, could not even use a phone app to count votes. And so in some respects, that's the case. But the ultimate winner, other than Donald Trump, was Michael Bloomberg. Mm-hmm. And you've got some new information on that, because now he will be part of the next debate. He did not qualify under the old rules, But the Democratic National Committee changed the rules, which has caused all sorts of people, especially some of the minority candidates, to say, wait a minute, when Cory Booker suggested some changes, no, we can't do that. When a variety of other individuals suggested that, Julian Castro and all the rest, that you can go down that long list, they didn't change it, now they did. So he will be at the next debate before New Hampshire, right?
He will, but he's not part of the New Hampshire primary, I don't think. Or is
Which
he
is
running in it?
No, I don't think so. So it's even more interesting that they did it then.
He's just opted out of these two. But yeah, I don't know. I question the motivation. I think it may have to do with their fear of Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
Because Bernie Sanders, I mean, he felt he was unfairly treated last time, and he demanded some changes in Iowa that could have been part of the reason there was such a mess there this time, because they had to give a lot of more information. They had to give the raw vote,
right,
which he won, the raw vote. He won on the first vote, but then you have the second vote with the realignment, and then you have the delegate count. They had to provide all three of those, and I think that may have been part of this issue and this problem. But anyway, yeah, Bloomberg says now he's going to double his ad spending and add more staff. So he's the real winner. He and Donald Trump are the real winners of the Iowa caucus.
I always say we apologize in advance to those of you in Iowa because you get pummeled by these ads and all these individuals walking all over your state. Well, now Bloomberg is maybe going to have some ads in New Hampshire. So again, I apologize to them, but those will really heat up pretty quickly in Nevada and South Carolina. But most importantly, on March 3rd, we have a Super Tuesday, which is huge.
Yeah. 10
different states, in particular two that are delegate heavy, which would be California and Texas. And if you're just going to get pummeled by Michael Bloomberg ads over the next couple of weeks.
They may start quicker than you're even saying, Kirby, because California early voting started. It's already started.
Oh, my goodness. And we grew up in California, so we remember what it was like when you voted in June. It didn't make a difference. But this
makes
time,
a big difference now.
It's going to be a real difference. So early voting, so there you go. So those are just a couple of issues. Penna said she will be with us on Friday. We'll also have Jeremy Dice there. I might just mention that tomorrow is Thursday. Oh, yes, we will have a few things. Jim Dennison's going to be in studio. We'll be talking about a couple of those topics as well that are things that he writes on the daily briefing and the daily article. But again, there are a number of articles that we have posted for you on the website. The transcript of the State of the Union address, the baby born at 21 weeks. What a great illustration of that. Some information about this impeachment vote that should take place in the next couple of hours. And then one that I didn't get to today, maybe we'll mention tomorrow. Dennis Prager, the question that explains everything. All of it is available on our website, pointofview.net. Penna Dexter, thank you. I know you're a busy woman, but thank you for coming in today, and it means a lot that you did. Let's just encourage you to go find those articles. My Viewpoints commentary today on the global birth dearth, a very good piece that was put together more recently that I thought you might really appreciate, and it is by Lyman Stone, which goes on for a number of pages. So, by the way, if you want to print it out, I got it both in the magazine, but if you print it out on your printer, it will take you a few pieces of pages, and it just illustrates, again, why we around the table are pro-life. Andrew, thank you for gathering all those clips. Steve, thank you for your help as well. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. the Point of View radio talk show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.